The snow had been falling since Tuesday, and by Thursday morning, it had buried Chicago under 14 inches of silence. Daniel Carter stood at the window of his third-floor apartment in Riverside, watching the street below disappear. A plow had come through sometime around midnight. But the snow didn't care. It filled in the tracks within an hour, smoothed everything back to white, and kept falling. The city didn't stop for weather like this. It just moved slower, heavier, like a man carrying too much. He turned from the window. The kitchen counter held three things. A half-empty box of cereal, a power bill with a red stripe across the top, and a mug of coffee that had gone cold 20 minutes ago. He picked up the coffee anyway. Cold was fine. Cold was something he was used to. Down the hallway behind the door with the paper star she'd taped there in September. Lily was still asleep. She was 8 years old. She had her mother's dark brown hair and her mother's way of tilting her head when she was thinking hard about something. She also had for the past 11 months her mother's silence, though not by choice. After the funeral, after the weeks of school and social workers and gentle voices asking her how she was feeling, Lily had simply stopped talking. Not entirely. She said yes and no. She said more when she wanted more cereal. She said cold when she needed a blanket. But the full sentences, the questions, the stories she used to tell about her drawings, those had gone somewhere deep and hadn't come back. The doctors called it selective mutism, acute grief response. Daniel called it the sound of a broken heart. He drank the cold coffee and opened his laptop on the kitchen table. He had applied to 11 jobs in the past 3 weeks. 2 had responded. 1 wanted a driver with a commercial license. He had a regular license, nothing more. The other was a delivery route that started at 3 a.m. and paid $9 an hour, which after gas and taxes would barely cover the cost of after-school care for Lily. He'd been running numbers all morning. The rent was due on the 1st. He had $340 in his checking account. He needed $1,150. The listings on the job board blurred together. Warehouse. Warehouse. Security overnight. Warehouse. Restaurant line cook. No experience necessary, but prefer 3 years. He scrolled without hope. Then he saw it. Private driver needed immediate start. $28 per hour guaranteed. No prior experience required. Discretion expected. Inquiries. Harmon Staffing. Ask for Vincent. He read it twice. $28 an hour was almost triple what he was making at his last job before the layoff. He read the fine print. No background check listed, though he had a clean record anyway. Hours 7 a.m. to 6 p.m. Monday through Saturday. The posting was 3 days old. He called Vincent. Vincent answered on the second ring, which was unusual enough that Daniel immediately lowered his expectations. People who answered quickly either desperately needed to fill a position or were running something that wasn't quite legitimate. Mr. Carter, Vincent's voice was measured. Professional. You're calling about the Hayes posting. I am. Is the position still open? A pause that lasted exactly 1 second too long. It is. We've had some turnover. What kind of work is it? Private driving. 1 client. You drive her where she needs to go when she needs to go. You don't ask questions about the destinations. You don't initiate conversation. You arrive on time. You dress professionally. And you maintain complete confidentiality about your employer's schedule and personal matters. Daniel wrote Hayes on the back of the power bill. Who's the client? Eleanor Hayes. He knew the name. Most people in Chicago knew the name. Eleanor Hayes was the founder and CEO of Hayes Development Group, one of the largest real estate development companies in the Midwest. He'd seen her face on the side of a building once years ago, a billboard for some downtown revitalization project. She was probably 60, maybe older. Sharp jaw, eyes that didn't waste time. Why has there been turnover? Daniel asked. Another pause. The environment is quiet. Not all drivers adapt well to it. Quiet how? Miss Hayes does not speak. She communicates through written notes and gestures. She has not spoken aloud for some time now. The drivers who left found the silence difficult to manage. Daniel looked at Lily's door. He thought about a child who had gone 11 months without stringing more than 2 words together, and how he had learned to live inside that silence without being destroyed by it. "I can manage quiet," he said. He started the next morning. The address Vincent had given him was in Lincoln Park, one of the expensive neighborhoods north of downtown, where the houses had 3-car garages and wrought iron fences with stone finials. Daniel drove his 2009 Honda Civic to the service entrance of a property that was by any honest measure extraordinary. A Victorian-era mansion that had been restored with precise care, every detail correct, the kind of building that cost so much to maintain that the maintenance itself became a full-time operation. He sat in front of the gates for a moment before they opened. The estate looked sealed. That was the word that came to him. Not just quiet, sealed, like something that had been closed up against the weather and never reopened. The snow on the front walk was undisturbed. The curtains in every visible window were drawn. There were no lights on in any room he could see from the driveway, though it was 7 o'clock in the morning and fully dark outside. He stepped out of his car, straightened his coat. He'd borrowed a presentable black jacket from his neighbor, who was about the same size and had better taste, and rang the bell. The door opened before the echo of the bell had finished. A woman stood in the entrance. She was perhaps 62, tall, with white hair pulled back in a posture so precise it looked architectural. She wore a charcoal suit. She looked at him for exactly 3 seconds. Then turned and walked back inside. He followed. The interior of the house was immaculate and completely still. No music, no television, no ambient noise of any kind. The housekeeper, he would later learn her name was Margaret, though she kept largely to herself, moved through the hallway and handed him a folded card. "The car is in the garage. Keys are on the hook to your left. Schedule for today is enclosed. You will not be spoken to. You will not speak unless I initiate." Below that, in smaller lettering, E. Hayes. He unfolded the schedule. 4 stops. No explanations given for any of them. He picked up the keys. The car was a black Mercedes S-Class, late model, impeccably maintained. It smelled of leather and something faintly floral, though there were no flowers anywhere in the garage. Daniel drove it out front at 7:45 a.m., exactly as the schedule specified. He left the engine running, stepped out, and opened the rear passenger door. He stood beside it with his hands folded in front of him, the way he'd seen drivers do it in movies, which felt slightly absurd but also felt correct for this particular situation. Eleanor Hayes came through the front door at 7:48. She was not what he'd expected, though he would have struggled to articulate what he had expected. The billboard version of her, authoritative, commanding, was still there in the architecture of her face and the way she carried herself. But something had been removed, not her dignity, something else. Some vital engine, some internal movement that living people have in their eyes and hands, and the small adjustments of their expression. It had been switched off. She wore a black wool coat, perfectly pressed. Her hair was white and pulled back. She looked at Daniel without any particular expression and then looked away toward the car and walked to it. She didn't acknowledge the open door, but she didn't acknowledge him either. She simply got in as though the door had opened on its own and the car had always been there waiting. He closed the door, got in the driver's seat, checked the address on the schedule card. 750 Calvary Cemetery, 4900 North Clark Street. He drove. The silence in the car was the kind that has weight. Not uncomfortable, exactly, more like the silence inside a room where something important had recently happened. It asked you to be careful with yourself, to move quietly, to not disrupt whatever was still settling. He did not speak. He found the cemetery entrance, pulled through the gate, and followed the single road that wound through the grounds. He did not know where to stop, and there was nothing on the schedule card beyond the address, so he idled near the main path and waited. Eleanor got out of the car without a word. She walked across the snow carefully, but without hesitation, as though she had made this exact walk hundreds of times, toward a section of graves near a stand of bare oak trees. Daniel watched in the side mirror. She stood at one grave for a long time, her hands clasped in front of her, her head slightly bowed, not praying exactly, just present. He kept the engine running to maintain the heat. When she returned 15 minutes later, her face was exactly as it had been when she left. No red eyes, no visible emotion, just that same quality of stillness, sealed and opaque. He drove to the second address, a rehabilitation facility on the north side, clean, institutional, the kind of building that was designed to communicate hope through its architecture, but mostly communicated effort. Eleanor went inside. He waited in the parking lot for 32 minutes. She came back to the car alone. Third stop, a vacant lot on the far west side where the skeleton of a building frame rose out of the snow, half-constructed, abandoned mid-project. The lumber gray and weathered. Eleanor stood at the chain-link fence that surrounded it and looked at the frame for several minutes without moving. He watched her in the rearview mirror. He had spent 11 months learning to read silence. He had learned that silence was not uniform, that it had textures and temperatures, that a child who was silent because she was peaceful was entirely different from a child who was silent because she was containing something she couldn't release. He had learned to tell the difference. Eleanor Hayes was containing something vast. Fourth stop, a neighborhood he knew well, Riverside. She had him park on Garfield Street, 3 blocks from his own apartment. She got out and walked the sidewalk slowly, looking at the buildings, the row houses with their painted brick, the small grocery on the corner, the community garden behind the chain-link fence where someone had wrapped the bare rose canes in burlap for the winter. She looked at everything with an expression that was for the first time all day something other than sealed. It was closer to sorrow, a specific directed sorrow. She stood in front of an empty storefront for a long time. He drove her home. She got out without a gesture, without a note. Just back inside the house and the door closed and the snow kept falling. Daniel sat in the parked Mercedes in the driveway for a moment. He thought about what he'd just spent 10 hours doing and whether he could explain it to anyone and decided that he couldn't. He walked back to his Civic and drove home to Riverside, 3 miles away. The schedule did not change. Day 2, Calvary Cemetery. The rehab facility, the abandoned building frame, Riverside. Same sequence, same timing, same total silence. Day 3. Identical. By day 4, Daniel had stopped looking at the schedule card before he drove. He knew the route, the way you know a song without thinking, just by feel. He also knew what each stop looked like in the changing winter light. The cemetery in the morning fog, the light flat and gray, and the headstones half submerged in snow. The rehab facility at midday, visitors going in and out through the automatic doors. Eleanor always alone when she emerged. The building frame at early afternoon, pigeons roosting in the exposed joists, their small gray bodies pressed together against the cold. In Riverside at the end of every day, Eleanor standing on the sidewalk in her black coat, looking at the neighborhood as though she were memorizing it or as though she were looking for something she'd lost and wasn't sure was still there. He started to piece things together. The cemetery, someone's grave, someone she visited every single day, which was not casual grief. That was the kind of devotion that only came from guilt, or from a loss so recent and raw that the wound hadn't formed scar tissue yet. The grave was in a section of the cemetery with modest headstones, not the ornate monuments that would be appropriate for a billionaire's family, someone younger, maybe. The grave was not large. The rehab facility. He noticed by the third visit that Eleanor never went to the reception desk. She went directly to a small room off the main hallway. He could see her through the glass double doors from where he was parked, and she sat alone in that room with the lights off for 20, 30 minutes before she came back out. It wasn't a visiting room. It looked like a room that might have been used for someone who was no longer there. The abandoned building. He'd driven by that block before, years ago, when it was still under construction. He couldn't remember what it had been intended to be, something residential, maybe. The frame was substantial. This had been designed as something more than a simple house. Now it was just lumber and rust and snow. Riverside. He didn't know yet. But Eleanor stood in front of that empty storefront every single day and looked at it with that expression. That was the closest she came to pain, and he filed it away. On day 6, he arrived at the cemetery and sat in the car while Eleanor made her walk, and he noticed for the first time the name on the headstone she visited. Ethan Michael Hayes, 1988-2022, beloved son, 34 years old. He looked at that inscription in the rearview mirror for a long moment, then looked away. It was a Wednesday, the second week, when the school called. The call came at 6:45 in the morning before Daniel had finished his coffee. The phone buzzing against the kitchen table with a number he recognized as Lily's school. A pipe had burst in the boiler room overnight. School was closed. He had 45 minutes before he was supposed to pick up the Mercedes. His neighbor, Rebecca, the one who'd lent him the jacket, wasn't home. He tried 3 other numbers. Nothing. He called Vincent at Harmon Staffing. "I have a situation," Daniel said. "My daughter's school is closed. I don't have anyone to watch her. I can bring her with me if Miss Hayes allows it. Or I'll call the house." Vincent said. "Hold on." He held for 4 minutes. "The house says it's acceptable for today. Don't make it a habit." Lily sat in the backseat of the Civic on the drive to Lincoln Park. Wearing her winter coat and her red knit hat with the pom-pom that she'd had since she was 5 and refused to give up, her sketchbook in her lap. She didn't ask where they were going. She looked out the window at the snow. When they transferred to the Mercedes, Eleanor Hayes was already at the front door waiting. She looked at Lily with an expression that was not the sealed blankness she applied to everything else. It was something sharper, more immediate, something that opened a little involuntarily, the way a face opens when it recognizes something it wasn't expecting to see. Lily looked back at Eleanor with complete composure. This was something Daniel had noticed about his daughter. She was not afraid of quiet adults. Most children found silence in grown-ups unsettling. Lily had been living inside silence for so long that she recognized it in others and moved toward it rather than away from it. She got into the back seat without prompting. Eleanor got in on the other side. They sat next to each other. Daniel drove to the cemetery. Eleanor got out. Lily watched from the window. She watched Eleanor walk through the snow to the grave under the oak trees, and she watched her stand there with her hands clasped. When Eleanor came back to the car, Lily turned in the seat to face her fully, not staring, not invasive, just facing her. The way you face someone when you're ready to listen. Eleanor did not react. She looked out her own window at the abandoned building frame. While Eleanor stood at the fence, Lily opened her sketchbook. Daniel watched in the rearview mirror. She drew quickly with the focused intensity she always brought to drawing. It was where most of her expression lived. Now, in those pages, she drew for about 8 minutes while Eleanor stood at the fence. When Eleanor came back to the car and settled into her seat, Lily held out the sketchbook. It was a simple drawing done in pencil with a yellow crayon for light. A house, not the abandoned frame outside. A finished house, walls and roof and windows with warm yellow squares where the lights were on. Snow on the ground, snow on the roof, but inside the windows there was light. Eleanor looked at the drawing. Her hands folded in her lap went very still. She didn't take the sketchbook, but she didn't look away from it either. She looked at that drawing for a long time, long enough that Daniel glanced back twice in the mirror, long enough that he held his breath without entirely meaning to. Then slowly, Eleanor reached out and took the sketchbook from Lily's hands. She held it carefully with both hands, like something that might break. She looked at the drawing, the small yellow squares of light, the snow, the finished house, and something moved through her face. Not expression, not yet. More like the movement you see in ice when the temperature changes and the surface shifts microscopically, announcing something coming. She handed the sketchbook back after a long moment. She turned to her window, but she didn't signal for Daniel to drive immediately. She sat for an extra minute, looking at the building frame through the glass. He drove to Riverside. On the walk home that evening, Lily held his hand. She did this sometimes. Still, she was 8. And sometimes she still wanted to hold her father's hand, and he thought he would probably let her for as long as she allowed it. He squeezed once, she squeezed back. He didn't know what had happened in the car. He knew that something had. It was a Friday afternoon, the 3rd week, when Eleanor Hayes spoke for the first time. They were parked at the abandoned building frame. Eleanor had been standing at the fence for longer than usual, 12 minutes instead of the usual 5 or 6. When she came back to the car and sat down, she didn't settle in the way she normally did. She sat forward slightly, her hands on her knees, and she looked at the building frame through the windshield. Daniel was about to shift into drive. He wanted to finish it. Her voice was low and slightly rough, the voice of someone who hadn't used it in some time, but it was composed, precise. She was not a woman who spoke carelessly, even after months of silence. Daniel kept both hands on the wheel and did not turn around. She continued. He had the permits. He had the contractors. He had spent 3 years designing it. He wasn't an architect, but he taught himself. He wanted it to be a community center for this neighborhood, a place where, she stopped. He had very specific ideas about what it would have inside. A recording studio, tutoring rooms, a kitchen where they could teach people to cook. He had grown up here. Actually, before we moved, before things changed. She paused for a long time, long enough that Daniel thought she might be done. His name was Ethan, my son. The snow made no sound against the windshield. The building frame stood gray and patient in the cold. He struggled for a long time. Drugs primarily. I sent him to every program I could find. Some of them helped temporarily. The last one, the facility we drive past, he was there for 8 months. He was doing better. He was genuinely truly doing better. Her voice didn't break. It just became more careful, more deliberate, like she was handling something that required precise movement. He called me every Sunday. He told me about the center, about this neighborhood, about what he wanted to build. She looked at the building frame. I was in Singapore when he relapsed. I had meetings, important meetings. I had been in Singapore for 11 days, and I had 2 more days scheduled, and I thought he's doing well. He can manage 2 more days. My assistant had been checking in with the facility. Everything was fine. A pause. Everything was not fine. Daniel's hands were very still on the wheel. He died on a Thursday morning in October. The building frame had been standing since the previous spring. He never got to see it finished. She was quiet for a moment. The permits expired while I was managing his estate. The contractors moved on. I couldn't bring myself to restart the project. And then I couldn't bring myself to do anything at all. She finally leaned back against the seat. The cemetery, the facility where he recovered. This building and this neighborhood where he grew up, where he wanted to come back to. A very small, very dry sound that was not quite a laugh. I drive these 4 places every day because I don't know what else to do. My doctors call it a complicated grief response. I call it owing him something. Daniel waited to be sure she was finished. He sounds like someone worth owing something to, he said. She didn't respond for a moment then. Yes, he was. He didn't plan to tell her. It came out the following week on a Tuesday when they were parked in Riverside and she had been sitting in the car longer than usual, watching the neighborhood through the window, and the silence had shifted from its usual sealed quality to something that was somehow more open. My wife's name was Carol, he said. Eleanor didn't move. She got sick about 3 years ago. Inflammatory cardiomyopathy. Her heart was attacking itself. There's a surgery that has a pretty good success rate, but it costs a lot. We had insurance, but not the right kind. By the time we figured out the financial piece, she'd had 2 events, and the surgery window had gotten complicated. He looked at the empty storefront across the street. She died 14 months ago. Lily was 7. She didn't say much for a few days after, which I thought was normal. Then a week went by and then a month and she just stopped. The full sentences, the stories. She still draws all the time. Everything she wants to say, she puts in the drawings. He paused. The doctors say it'll come back, that it's a coping mechanism, and that as long as she keeps expressing herself through the drawings, through the small words she does use, she'll eventually find her way back to language. I believe them. Some days are harder than others. Eleanor was looking at him now in the rearview mirror. He could see her eyes. I took this job because I had $340 and rent was due, he said. I'm not telling you that to make you feel something. I'm telling you because you told me the truth about Ethan and it seems like the fair thing to do. She held his gaze in the mirror for a moment. Then she looked back out the window at Riverside. The empty storefront, she said, is where Ethan used to go after school. It was a music shop. He started learning guitar there when he was 12. The owner let him practice in the back room for free because he couldn't afford lessons. She paused. The owner retired 8 years ago. The shop has been empty since. They sat in that together. Two parents, both shattered by different losses, sitting in a black Mercedes in a neighborhood full of people who were about to lose something, too, though they didn't know it yet. He had not planned to say any of that. He had not planned to say anything at all. But there was something about Eleanor Hayes, about the way she held her grief without performing it, without asking anyone to witness it, that made honesty feel less like exposure and more like the only appropriate response. She did not say she was sorry for his loss. He was grateful for that. He had heard those words so many times in the past 14 months that they had lost their shape entirely. She simply sat with what he'd told her, the way she sat with everything, fully, without turning away, and that was more than enough. Daniel found the documents by accident. He was in the garage at the Hayes estate waiting for Eleanor to come down for the morning pickup, and he noticed a manila folder wedged under a stack of architectural plans on the workbench by the tool cabinet. The folder had slid partially open and the first page was visible, a property survey map of a section of Chicago's West Side. He would not have thought anything of it, except that the cross streets on the map were familiar. He looked more carefully without touching the folder. The red shaded boundary on the map encompassed 6 blocks of Riverside. His neighborhood, his street, his building, 3 floors up. The project title at the top of the visible page read Riverside Corridor Redevelopment Phase 1 Acquisition. He stepped back from the workbench and stood very still for a moment. Then he heard Eleanor's footsteps in the hallway. He said nothing that morning or the next. He spent 2 evenings researching the project on his laptop after Lily was asleep. City Planning Board filings, the Hayes Development Group website, a Chicago Tribune article from 4 months ago that mentioned a proposed mixed-use development in the Riverside area pending community approval and zoning variance. Community approval pending, which meant the community didn't know yet, or some of them did, and the rest were about to find out. His building was in the red shaded zone. So were the homes of at least 24 families he knew by name. So was the community garden. So was the corner grocery where Mrs. Paulson had been working the register since before Daniel was born. On the 8th day after he found the folder, he didn't drive Eleanor to the 4th stop. He parked on Garfield Street as usual, but when Eleanor moved to get out, he said, "Can I ask you something before we do this today?" She stopped. She looked at him, not with offense, but with assessment. He had broken the most fundamental rule of the job. "There's a development project," he said carefully. "A redevelopment plan for this neighborhood. The one your company is running." A very long pause. "Yes," she said. "My apartment is in the acquisition zone. So is my daughter's school. So is every family I've known for 6 years." He kept his voice level. He had decided to be clear and direct, not angry. Anger would close this conversation. "You come here every day because your son wanted to build something for this neighborhood and your company is planning to demolish it." Eleanor's hands were very still in her lap. Ethan didn't want this place torn down. Daniel said he wanted to add something to it. He wanted the building frame on Halstead to be a community center. He spent 3 years on that project. He paused. "You've been coming here every day for what, a year? You stand on this block and you look at the place where he grew up. Do you actually see it? The families, the grocery store, the garden." The silence was different from the usual kind. The board approved the financial projections in September. Eleanor said, her voice careful but not defensive. She was processing something. "The project has significant value. The area has been identified as underutilized." "It's not underutilized." Daniel said. "It's full of people who have nowhere else to go." She looked out the window at the street. The corner grocery. A woman walking out with 2 bags, her breath clouding in the cold. A man scraping his windshield 3 spaces down. 2 kids on the sidewalk throwing snow at each other, laughing with their whole bodies. "Ethan grew up on this block," she said quietly. "He used to throw snow at the Jenkins boy." Lily's voice came from the back seat. "Small. Careful. Don't take it away." Daniel went perfectly still. 3 words, full sentence. Lily, who had not strung more than 2 words together in 11 months, looking at Eleanor Hayes with clear, serious eyes and saying, "Don't take it away." Eleanor turned to face her. For a long moment, none of them moved. The snow fell outside the windows. The kids on the sidewalk were still laughing. The woman with the grocery bags had gotten into her car. Then Eleanor Hayes, CEO of Hayes Development Group, one of the most powerful real estate developers in the Midwest, closed her eyes. And for the first time in over a year, her face broke. Not dramatically. Not with sounds, just a single line of tears from the outer corner of each eye, moving slowly down toward her jaw, and her face doing what grief does to faces when it finally gets out. Daniel looked at the steering wheel. He gave her the silence she needed. After a while, she said, "I need to make a call." The board meeting was scheduled for the following Thursday. Daniel knew because Eleanor told him, not in full detail, but enough. "There is a meeting I need you to drive me to on Thursday. It is important." She said this on the Tuesday after the tears, with her voice returned to its careful composure and her face back to its habitual stillness. But not the same stillness as before. Something had shifted in the set of her eyes. He drove her to the Hayes Development Group offices in the Loop. The building was 42 floors of steel and glass, the kind of structure that announced itself clearly. Money lives here. Decisions happen here. The world is shaped here. Eleanor walked through the lobby without stopping and took the express elevator to the 38th floor. Daniel waited in the lobby. He sat in a leather chair near the windows and watched the snow outside, and he waited. He had gotten good at waiting. The last several weeks had been an education in patience, in learning that the important things did not happen quickly, that they accumulated slowly, the way snow accumulated, one flake at a time, until the whole world was different. He waited for 93 minutes. In the boardroom, he would learn this much. Later, Eleanor Hayes had laid 3 things on the conference table in front of 10 people who made their living approving projects that generated returns measured in 8 figures. The first was a photograph of Ethan at age 22, standing on the corner of Garfield and Halstead in Riverside, squinting in summer sunlight, laughing at whoever was behind the camera. The second was a photocopied page from a notebook in Ethan's handwriting. A list titled "What the Center Needs" with items like good acoustics in the studio, after-school tutoring MWF, kitchen big enough for classes, and somewhere to sit that doesn't feel institutional. The third was Lily's drawing. The house with the yellow light in the windows, the snow on the roof. She presented the financial case first. She was a CEO and she knew that the people in this room responded to numbers and she had done the numbers. The Riverside Corridor project had a projected return of 22%. A redesigned project, one that preserved the existing residential structures and added community infrastructure rather than replacing them, had a projected return of 14%. She laid out both models with precision and clarity, and she did not apologize for the difference. Then she said, "I want to discuss what the 8% buys." She talked about Ethan, not the version of the story she saved for private conversations, the full version with the years of addiction and the failed attempts and the final 8 months that had gone so well and the call she didn't make when she should have made it. And the Thursday morning in October, she talked about the community center he had designed. She talked about the music shop on Garfield Street, closed now for 8 years. She talked about what a 14% return on a project that built something instead of demolishing something would mean for the families in the acquisition zone, for the neighborhood, and for the memory of a 34-year-old man who had spent 3 years designing a building that was still just a frame in the snow. The vote was 7-3. 7 in favor of the redesigned project. It was not unanimous. 3 board members voted against it and they were not wrong to do so. The financial difference was real and the shareholders would notice it. Eleanor had prepared for this too. She had a letter drafted before the meeting offering to personally underwrite the difference in projected returns from her own assets, removing the financial risk from the company entirely. When the meeting ended, she walked back through the lobby to where Daniel was waiting. She sat down in the chair next to him. "It's done," she said. He nodded. "I'd like to restart the permits on the Halstead building," she said. "Ethan's building. I want to finish it under his name. The Ethan Hayes Community Center." "Good," Daniel said. I'd also like to discuss your future employment. I am going to need someone to manage the community center, project site coordination, community liaison. That kind of work. It is a 2-year project minimum. I don't know if you're interested. He looked at her. I don't have experience managing construction projects. He said, you have experience managing complicated situations with a great deal of patience and no instruction. She said, the construction management can be hired. What I need is someone who understands what this neighborhood is and why it matters. A pause. I believe you qualify. He thought about the $340 in his checking account. He thought about the power bill with the red stripe. He thought about Lily's sketchbook full of houses with yellow light in the windows. I'll need to think about it, he said. She nodded. Take the week. The permits were refiled in January. Eleanor hired a firm called Moorhead and Associates to take over the structural engineering. The original contractors had moved on to other projects, but the plans Ethan had left behind were detailed enough that a competent team could pick them up with minimal revision. Daniel attended the first site meeting with Eleanor and the lead architect, a quiet man named Thomas Farrow, who had the exact right combination of professional rigor and genuine interest in the project's intent. He walked through Ethan's notebook page by page with them, asking careful questions, making notes. The recording studio is technically challenging, Farrow said. Acoustic isolation in a building of this size and budget will require some creative solutions, but it's absolutely doable. Eleanor nodded. Do it. Daniel took the job. He had accepted it the day after Eleanor offered it. Having done the math and the soul searching and found that both pointed the same direction, he gave Vincent at Harmon Staffing 2 weeks' notice, a formality, technically, since the job had always been month to month, and he moved into the project coordinator role with the awareness that he was learning as he went and that this was in fact exactly the right preparation for it. He spent his first week in the role walking Riverside. He knocked on doors. He explained the project, what it had been, what it had become, what it was going to be. Some people were suspicious. A man named George, who had been a vocal opponent of the original redevelopment plan and had organized the community meeting where residents first learned their homes might be affected, listened to Daniel for 20 minutes and then said, "So, you're telling me this billionaire had a change of heart?" "I'm telling you her company changed its project," Daniel said. "The homes in the acquisition zone are off the table. The Halstead building is being finished as a community center. The storefront on Garfield, the old music shop, there are preliminary plans to restore it as part of the center's programming." George was quiet for a moment. "Who else is involved in the planning process? Is there community representation?" "That's partly why I'm here," Daniel said. "We're forming an advisory committee. I'd like you to be on it." George considered this for a long time. "I'll think about it," he said. He became the advisory committee chair. Over the next several weeks, he also became unexpectedly someone Daniel had coffee with on Tuesday mornings before the site visits, a man with strong opinions about zoning laws and a dry humor that took some time to locate, but was worth finding once you did. Lily, meanwhile, was doing something new. It started quietly. The way everything with Lily started, not an announcement, just a shift, a small change in pattern that Daniel noticed before it became definitive. She started coming home from school with more words. A sentence here, a longer answer when he asked how her day was. She told him one evening over dinner that her teacher had given her a part in the class play, a small part, 3 lines, and that she had agreed to do it. "You said yes?" he asked carefully, keeping his voice neutral. She nodded. "Then it didn't seem that scary." He put down his fork and looked at her. "That's really good, Lily." She looked at her plate. Then she looked back up at him and she said, "Is Eleanor going to come to the play?" He sat with that for a moment. "I can ask her," he said. The Ethan Hayes Community Center opened on a Saturday in late February. It was still winter. Chicago rarely negotiated on this point, but the day had a different quality than the weeks before it. The light came at a different angle. The snow on the ground had the slightly granular texture of snow that was thinking about becoming something else. There were people everywhere on the Halstead block, more than Daniel had ever seen on that block at one time, standing around in coats and scarves with Cups of coffee from the folding table someone had set up near the entrance. The building was extraordinary. Pharaoh and his team had honored every line of Ethan's original plans. The main hall was open and warm with high ceilings and a polished concrete floor and tall windows along the south wall that let in the gray winter light. The recording studio occupied the northwest corner, acoustically isolated, properly wired with a modest but professional-grade equipment setup that had been donated in part by a music industry contact Eleanor had made through the Hayes Foundation. The kitchen was large enough for a class of 12. The tutoring rooms were small and sensibly furnished and had that quality of prepared readiness of space waiting to be used. On the wall of the entrance hall in simple lettering on a brushed metal panel, "For Ethan Michael Hayes, who designed this place and every person it will serve." Eleanor stood in front of that panel for a long time before the opening began. She had been different these past several weeks, not unrecognizable. She was still precise, still careful with words, still more comfortable with silence than most people. But the engine that had been switched off was running again, dimmer than it had probably been before the loss of Ethan and perhaps permanently reconfigured. But present, turning over. She had resumed attending Hayes Development Group board meetings in person. She had restructured the Hayes Foundation to include a community development mandate with Riverside as its inaugural project. She had spoken twice at public events, once at the City Planning Board, and once at a community forum in the Riverside Neighborhood Center, and both times her voice had been steady. She had attended Lily's school play. She had sat in a folding chair in the second row of the school gymnasium, and watched Lily, in a white dress with a paper crown, deliver 3 lines with the composure and precision of someone who had been practicing since November. Lily had looked for Eleanor in the audience before she spoke. She had found her. She had taken a breath. "The winter is ending," Lily had said on stage. To the gymnasium full of parents and siblings. "The winter is ending, and the flowers are coming, and everything that was cold is going to be warm again." It was a line from the script, a line written by someone else for a story about a princess and a thaw and the return of spring. But Eleanor had pressed her lips together and looked at the program in her lap, and her jaw had worked very slightly, and she had clapped with everyone else when the scene ended. After the play in the school parking lot, Lily had walked over to Eleanor and said without preamble. "You came." "I came," Eleanor said. "Did you like it very much?" Lily thought about this. Then she said, "My mom used to come to everything." Eleanor was quiet for a moment. "I know," she said. "I'm sorry she isn't here." Lily looked at her with those clear, steady eyes. "You can come to the next one," she said. And then she went back to Daniel and took his hand. Standing in the entrance hall of the community center on opening day, Daniel watched Eleanor in front of the memorial panel, and he watched the people filing in behind her. George with his wife and 3 children, Mrs. Paulson from the corner grocery. The woman he'd seen that day in the street with the 2 bags. The kids who'd been throwing snow at each other. All of them grown up enough to be here today. The people of Riverside walking into a building that belonged to them in a neighborhood that still belonged to them on a block that had been saved by a combination of grief and 3 words spoken by a child in the back seat of a black Mercedes. Lily was beside him, her sketchbook under her arm. She had drawn something new this morning. He'd seen it at breakfast. A building with tall windows and warm light inside. A crowd of small figures in front of it and above the door in her careful 8-year-old lettering. Ethan's place. He had not told her to draw it. She had simply drawn what she saw coming. Eleanor turned from the panel and walked toward them. She was wearing a coat he hadn't seen before, dark blue instead of black. A small change that meant more than it looked like. She looked at Lily. "Are you going to draw today?" she asked. "Yes," Lily said. "Will you show me when you're done?" Lily considered this with the gravity she brought to all important decisions. "You can keep it," she said. "If you want." Eleanor looked at her for a moment. "I would like that very much," she said. Lily nodded, satisfied, and went to find a good window to draw from. Daniel stood beside Eleanor and looked at the room filling with people, the steam from the coffee table rising in the winter air, the light coming through the tall south windows and laying itself across the polished floor in long, pale rectangles. "He would have liked this," Eleanor said. "Yes," Daniel said. he would have. They stood together in the warmth for a while, watching Lily find her spot at the window and open her sketchbook, her pencil moving already, drawing the view outside, the snow on the Halstead block, the bare trees, the people coming in from the cold, drawing what was outside so she could bring it in. Drawing the light. There is a photograph taken by a volunteer at the opening that ended up framed and hung in the entrance hall of the Ethan Hayes Community Center next to the memorial panel. 3 people standing together in winter coats. A man in his 30s with tired, kind eyes. A small girl in a red hat with a pom-pom. And an older woman in a dark blue coat with white hair. They are not looking at the camera. They are looking at something slightly to the left of it. Someone has said something, or Lily has pointed at something outside the window. And all 3 of them are turned in the same direction. Their faces open. They don't look like they were assembled by coincidence. They don't look like an employer and an employee and a child who had nowhere else to go on a school closure day. They look like people who found each other at the exact moment each one needed to be found. They look, if you stand in front of that photograph on a winter morning with the light coming through the south windows, like something that was always going to happen if the snow fell right and a man desperate enough to accept any job took a listing nobody wanted and drove 4 stops through Chicago every day until the silence between 2 broken people became slowly something else entirely. Outside the snow was still falling quietly and patiently. Inside the lights were on.